Who does what in the cockpit? As an airline pilot, I've been asked many times about the roles in the flight deck. Who does the takeoff and landing? What is the co-pilot's job? Who talks on the radio? And so on. So I thought I'd give you an overview of what the roles are and how they are managed throughout the flight. Let's start from the very first thing a passenger notices, the number of pilots in the cockpit. Nowadays, commercial aviation airplanes are flown with a single pilot or multiple pilots, also called multicrew. Generally, a small aircraft can be operated with a single pilot, since the airplane is relatively slow and simpler to operate than a bigger airliner, which makes having a single proficient pilot at the controls more than enough. With bigger airplanes come a lot more systems, more complexity, longer hours can be flown, and the overall workload is way higher, requiring more than one pilot to manage the aircraft throughout the flight. Single pilot operation is pretty much self-explanatory. The pilot is doing everything there is to do. With multi-pilot or multi-crew operation, the situation is different. Workload and duties are split between the pilots, and there needs to be a clear set of rules determining what the roles are before, during, and after the flight. Otherwise, confusion will arise, checks and processes will be missed, and as some past accidents showed us, safety will be endangered. When it comes to multi-crew operation, the first thing we need to have a look at are the roles of every person sitting in the flight deck: captain, first officer, second officer, flight engineers, and navigators. The captain's role is quite easy to understand. They are the man or woman in charge of the whole airplane. Normally, the captain, also called pilot in command, is the person with more experience among the crew and is generally a senior employee within the company that after many years of service and much experience gets appointed as captain. The pilot in command is the one who holds the final responsibility for everything that happens on board the aircraft: fuel decisions, flight planning requirements, dangerous freight transportation, misbehaving passengers, delays management are some of the things a captain is responsible for. The good thing is that they are not alone. The first officer and second officer are there to help. Obviously, in single pilot operations, the only pilot is the captain or pilot in command. A first officer, oftentimes called a co-pilot, is the second person in command, right after the captain. They are allowed to both fly the aircraft and manage radio communication, documents, and systems on the behalf of the captain, who, as mentioned, still retains the final authority and responsibility. The second officer is, you guessed it, the third person in charge after the captain and first officer, and normally is not allowed to fly the aircraft for the approach and landing phase, nor during takeoff and initial climb. They have controls during cruise, generally to provide relief to the captain or the first officer. Most airlines around the world don't require a second officer for their operation. Some intercontinental flights, however, may prompt the airlines to have them on board. Let's now make a jump in the past and talk about flight engineers and navigators. The flight engineer used to manage the systems on board to achieve the best possible operational status of the aircraft. They used to report system conditions to the pilots so that they could fly the airplane appropriately. With modern technologies, their role has been replaced by computers and advanced systems, like the FMS, that can self-monitor and that will automatically alert the pilots if something unexpected happens. The navigator's job was to keep track of the position and was able to figure it out even by just looking at the stars. Now GPS, inertial platforms, radar control, radio navigation stations, and flight management system, FMS, have taken their place. This profession is not so much of a jump in the past if we consider military operations. Do you remember Goose from Top Gun? Let's now have a look here at where all of them sit. The left seat is occupied by the captain, the right seat by the first officer. The second officer can basically jump in any seat as required to provide relief to either pilot. The flight engineer and the navigator used to be seated right behind the pilots. With the advancement of technology and a developed awareness towards safety led by learning from incidents and accidents that have happened over the years, the aviation world has defined two roles for the pilots: PF for pilot flying and PM for pilot monitoring. These roles are not associated to their rank, so a captain can either be pilot flying or pilot monitoring. Generally, when a duty consists of, let's say, 2 flights, one pilot would be the pilot flying on one flight and pilot monitoring on the other one. The identification of 2 separate roles in the cockpit makes sure that both pilots equally split the workload and a complete oversight is maintained. As simple and logical as this multi-crew role distinction may seem, it developed over many years and it took many incidents and accidents to happen before it became such an integral aspect of multi-crew operation. A very tragic accident saw a Lockheed L-1011 crash in Florida in 1972 after running out of fuel completely. The entire crew, both pilots and the flight engineer, were busy dealing with a burned-out landing gear indication light. Managing the aircraft was left to the autopilot and no one kept a close eye on the fuel level until it was too late. Duties weren't shared appropriately and important items were missed. With the way duties are now shared in multi-crew operation, this oversight should be easily avoided. But let's talk about what these roles actually consist of. The pilot flying, as the name suggests, controls the aircraft by manually flying or through the autopilot. They do both takeoff and landing and keep the correct attitude throughout the flight. The pilot monitoring looks after radio communications, the system status, reading the checklists, keeping an eye on the fuel consumption and updating the flight plan as the flight progresses. They also monitor what the pilot flying is doing and provide support if needed. The pilot flying-pilot monitoring split is a core aspect of multi-crew operation, since it allows both pilots to handle the aircraft as well as managing and monitoring the flight. By doing this, the tasks and duties are clear to both flight crew members and nothing should be missed or overlooked. Depending from the airline, the captain has additional tasks to perform, no matter if he or she is the pilot flying or pilot monitoring on that flight. These duties are controlling the airplane on the ground, for example during taxi, and taking over controls if an issue develops during the takeoff maneuver. Pilots constantly train on multi-crew procedures. On top of this, airlines nowadays hire pilots that completed a multi-crew cooperation course, or MCC course, if they don't have previous multi-crew experience. This is done to make sure they have at least the basics covered. By now, you should have a better understanding on how things get done in the flight deck and who does what during the flight. See you in the next lesson.